Many dictators had a long, happy life, only to eventually die a peaceful death. Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Hillary Clinton, the list goes on. But becoming a dictator is not always a good career move. Countless tyrants have met a bloody, violent end, from the OG dictators of ancient Rome to more recent silly geese like Mussolini. I've already made a video on dictators who died violently, but there are so many I decided to make a part 2, and this time we're going to focus on more obscure figures. Apart from Gaddafi, it's not a real list without him. Thomas Sankara was known as the African Che Guevara, which is something I too am often called. Born into the French colony of Upper Volta, he joined the military at a young age. Proving himself brave and charismatic, Sankara soon grew famous, eventually being given a position in the government of the then independent Upper Volta. But it was a time of turbulence, with military dictator after military dictator seizing power, and Sankara soon found himself under house arrest. So a group of Sankara's allies overthrew the government themselves, declaring a Marxist revolution and Sankara as president. At just 33, Thomas Sankara was now the leader of Upper Volta, which he soon renamed Burkina Faso. He redistributed lands to the poor, cut the salary of politicians, outlawed forced marriages, and planted millions of trees. Although an oppressive and violent ruler, he was beloved by his people, who were and still are among the poorest on earth. But after 4 years in power, Sankara was betrayed by his close friend and ally, Blaise Compaoré. In yet another coup, Sankara was shot more than a dozen times, and buried in an unmarked grave. Compaoré remained in power until 2014. Engelbert Dollfuss is genuinely the worst name I've ever heard. And that's saying a lot. Some people are called Wayne. It's not the kind of name a dictator should have, but that didn't hold him back. After World War I, Austria was a shell of its former self. Now landlocked and tiny, its future was uncertain, and it was in this chaos Dollfuss rose to power, first becoming a workers' union leader, and in 1931 being appointed Minister of Agriculture. Just 1 year later, he was appointed Chancellor by the Austrian president. Like Hitler, he had achieved this position through legitimate means, and like Hitler, he then became dictator. A fascist himself, Dollfuss first banned the Communist Party, and terrified of a Nazi takeover, then banned the Nazi Party of Austria. Inspired by Mussolini, he transformed Austria into a totalitarian one-party state, sparking a civil war. The war was against communist factions, but it was the Nazis who killed Dollfuss. The Austrian Nazi Party attempted to seize power in 1934. The putsch failed, but Dollfuss was shot dead. Though dead, his government survived another 4 years until Germany invaded. For 19 years there were two Vietnams. North Vietnam, a newly born communist state supported by the Soviets, and South Vietnam, a capitalist state supported by the West. We all know how the war ended, but you might not know quite how bad South Vietnam was. For much of the war it was an oppressive dictatorship led by the notorious Ngo Diem. An incompetent and brutal leader, Diem was ruthless in suppressing his enemies, which not only included communist guerrillas, but also Catholic monks. Though leading a Buddhist country, he was fiercely Catholic, regularly persecuting Buddhists and demeaning their faith. It got so bad monks began to protest by literally setting themselves on fire. Diem was hated like no one else. Not only was he a tyrant, but he was losing ground to communist insurgents. Ignoring his Western advisors, he came to be known for corruption and nepotism. So he grew to be hated by his own people, his own military, and his allies in the West. Everyone could see where it was going. In 1963, the CIA backed a military coup. Diem was deposed, and along with his closest allies, executed. Bound, sprayed with bullets, and stabbed multiple times. It was said JFK was horrified by the execution. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire ruled over Asia Minor, the city of Constantinople being its capital. But the situation within Constantinople was not always stable. In the year 1185, the emperor himself was murdered there by an angry mob. Having gained power during a brutal civil war, he had his own 14-year-old cousin executed as to be sole heir to the throne. Rumour circulated he also killed the boy's mother and was plotting further deaths. Then at the age of 65 he married a 12-year-old girl. He was a paranoid and violent ruler, transforming Byzantium into a terror state. Both noble and peasant hated their new ruler, and the capital fell into a near constant state of anarchy. Eventually he was forced to flee the city, but before he was able, an angry mob captured him. They pulled out his teeth, gouged out his eyes, cut off his limbs, and beat him to death. Dawood Khan was arguably Afghanistan's first dictator. Born into the royal family, his uncle was king of Afghanistan. When his cousin ascended to the throne, Dawood was appointed prime minister. He held this position for 10 years, during which he attempted to radically transform the country, moving towards the Soviet Union and initiating a land dispute with Pakistan. But these changes eventually proved too radical, and the king forced Dawood to resign. Big mistake. 10 years later, Dawood overthrew his cousin with a military coup d'etat. Then instead of declaring himself king, he declared Afghanistan a republic, taking over as president. The 2-century-long monarchy was gone, and Dawood held absolute power. Again he began to radically transform Afghanistan, this time moving away from the Soviets politically. He tried to improve women's rights, and improve relations with Pakistan, but that wasn't good enough. This was the 1970s. The Soviets couldn't afford to lose influence in Central Asia. Moscow backed an uprising in April of 1978, which saw the Afghan Communist Party take power. It's unclear how, but Dawood and most of his family were murdered in the presidential palace. The outside world was told he resigned for health reasons, and Afghanistan fell into civil war. People forget Portugal only became a democracy in 1974, and over the last century had many dictators. One of the first was Cydonia Pace. A high-ranking military officer, he served as ambassador to Germany until Portugal entered World War I. Then 1 year later, just 7 years after Portugal abolished its monarchy, he seized power. With just 250 soldiers, he forced the president to resign, and took over that position himself. Pace was now a military dictator, issuing decrees like a medieval king, and enforcing them like a modern general. He ignored the constitution when it suited him, but remained a highly popular figure. Many Portuguese saw him as the strong leader their country needed, but not everyone. In 1918, he was shot dead inside a train station. The assassin accused Pace of betraying the Republic by setting himself up as a new king, a common view at the time. Pace even came to be known as the President King. He never stood trial for the murder, instead being sent to an insane asylum, where he died 28 years later. Like the neighbouring state of Jordan, Iraq too was once a kingdom. In fact, their kings were from the same family. But the monarchy in Iraq was short-lived, having just 3 rulers, the last of which was called Faisal. When his father died in mysterious circumstances, he became king at the age of 3. For much of his reign it was his uncle who truly held power, but eventually he took over. Under his rule, the kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan came together, forming a new country called the Arab Federation, with himself as the senior of the 2 kings. But many within the Iraqi military were staunchly opposed to the union. In July of 1958, a group of officers carried out a coup. With most other members of the Iraqi royal family, he was lined up and shot. After less than 6 months, the Arab Federation was gone, as was the Iraqi monarchy, never to return. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire ruled over millions of people, but in its final years, power was not truly held by the Sultan. Instead, there were a series of military dictators. During World War I, that dictator was Enver Pacha. A military officer, he took power in 1913 with 2 others. Before the war, he was seen as a great leader, but with his regime committing the Armenian genocide, and the whole being on the losing side of the war thing, that changed quick. 2 days after the empire agreed to an armistice, he fled to exile. In absentia, he was sentenced to death by Turkish courts. He spent years floating around, befriending communist figures like Lenin. In 1921, Lenin gave him a job helping suppress an anti-Soviet revolt in Central Asia, but for some reason he defected, joining the rebellion. Before long he was leading it, but ultimately it was suppressed and Enver Pacha was killed. There are different stories of how he died. Some say he was shot through the heart in battle. Others say he was mobbed by Soviet soldiers and beheaded. One of the most powerful men of Imperial Rome was Lucius Janus. While not emperor himself, he gains dictatorial power by influencing Emperor Tiberius. Serving as bodyguard to the emperor, his influence grew over time. Tiberius was isolated and weak-willed, leaving him reliant on Sejanus. As Tiberius became more withdrawn from imperial duty, Sejanus became the real power in Rome, a secret emperor behind the scenes. Coins were minted bearing his image, statues erected in his name, and anyone in his way was killed. Sejanus even killed the emperor's son Drusus. He eliminated senators and wealthy figures at will. Some thought he was plotting to become the successor of Tiberius, which would explain his murder of Drusus. But he made too many enemies. One cold morning he was summoned to the Senate, who condemned Sejanus to die. He was strangled to death and thrown to an angry mob, who tore his body to pieces on the street. In 1969, Libya was a monarchy, ruled by King Idris, but in that year he was overthrown by a group of military officers led by Muammar Gaddafi. For the next 4 decades he ruled Libya, holding the title of brotherly leader, and doing all kinds of weird stuff. At one point he proposed the United Nations abolish Switzerland, which to be honest I'm in full support of. Yet he maintained his regime for a surprisingly long time. Then in 2010 a wave of revolutions broke out across the Middle East, and Libya fell into civil war. In part it was caused by a Western conspiracy, because Gaddafi opposed the petrodollar system. Google it. Long story short, he was captured by a group of rebels, who beat and abused him until one of them finally shot him. What a heartwarming tale.